Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for the next 4 episodes is Paul Barrett. Paul is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. His research sits at the intersection of Canadian literature, critical race studies, and digital humanities. I'll be speaking with Paul about his most recent book. It's called Remembering Austin Clarke, and it's an edited volume of personal reflections, biographical sketches, and scholarly critiques, along with some of Clarke's own selected works, that aims to secure Clarke's position among Canada's most celebrated and important writers. Clarke was born in Barbados and moved to Toronto in the mid-50s. His novels began appearing in the 60s, and he continued writing well into the 2000s. He won the coveted Giller Prize in 2002 for The Polished Hoe. He was a poet, short story writer, a journalist, and taught at Duke University, the University of Texas, and Yale, establishing Black Studies programs along the way. And yet, despite the awards, prestigious faculty positions, and prolific output, the Canadian literary establishment largely sidelined him because he was Black. In his chapter in the book, Paul describes the situation this way, quote, "Despite his contributions to Canadian writing and his status as a public figure, however, his work is absent from most Canadian literary history and criticism. Indeed, the worst drinking game in CanLit is to flip to the back of a literary history and take a drink for every Clarke, Austin entry in the index. You will be as sober as a late career Leonard Cohen," unquote. This book, Remembering Austin Clarke, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, aims to set the record straight and maybe even get you drunk. In this first episode, we talk about what Austin Clarke was like as a person, because Clarke's personality and the way he saw the world obviously informed his work, but also influenced his colleagues, friends, co-workers, and the Canadian literary establishment. Okay, Paul, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much.
All right, so let's start with, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure. So my name is Paul Barrett. I'm an assistant professor in the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph. And my area of interest is in Canadian literature and really diasporic Canadian literature. So people coming from elsewhere into Canada and describing the experience of their migration, how they arrive in Canada, what they find, and their engagement with ideas of nation, citizenship in Canada. I have a bit of a strange background in, I have a double major undergrad in computer science and English. So that comes up in my work a little bit, but not so much in my Austin Clarke research and writing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I guess for our listeners, I'm wondering if you could sort of help us situate Mr. Clarke and his work in the broader context of Canadian literature as you see it, sort of in its proper, deserved place. What kind of writer was he? And then give us a sense of how his writing was actually received as he was coming up.
Yeah, so Austin Clarke is an interesting writer, but a puzzling writer. He writes numerous novels, numerous short stories. He's a great short story writer. In his early career, he was a poet. He wrote a number of poems, collections of poetry, and he's one of Canada's earliest modern writers. So his early work predates some of the major figures we think of as classical Canadian writers. He comes before Alice Munro, before Margaret Atwood, before Michael Ondaatje, these kind of writers. So he's writing in the very early 1960s. And he's thinking about the relationship between Barbados, the Black diaspora, the Caribbean, and Canada, and thinking about ideas of race in Canada well before anybody else's. So his first book, The Survivors of the Crossing, takes this idea of crossing, of migration from one place to another, and then the histories of crossing throughout the history of the Black diaspora, and kind of mixes them together, set both in Barbados with a little bit of Canadian influence there. And throughout his career, he returns to these themes of crossing, diaspora, migration, throughout a number of novels and short stories, collections of poetry, even in his cookbooks. He wrote 2 cookbooks throughout his career. So he returns to these questions again and again. In terms of the question of what kind of writer is he, he's a really complex writer. one of the challenges Canadian critics have had with Clarke is that his style is difficult for them to interpret. And this isn't just because he's so thematically different, right? He's not writing about the kind of Canadian stereotypes of people, old farmers staring wistfully into snowbanks and then, having lives of quiet desperation. This is not his subject matter. He's writing about migration, about anti-Black racism, about the continuities between the modern multicultural country that Canada likes to imagine itself as, and the long legacies of empire, slavery, the plantation. So it's a different subject matter. But he's also drawing on a range of influences that is pretty eclectic. So if you don't listen to John Coltrane, if you haven't read Glissant or Brathwaite or Eliot or Trudeau or Baldwin or Wright or Amiri Baraka, it's hard to understand Clarke because all of these influences come together in a kind of polyglot blending or crossing, to come back to that term again. And this is in a way that exceeds the kinds of critical frameworks and national frameworks that Canadian literature has really been known for. So that's a long answer. But, in the 1960s, Canadian literature was really interested in the question of what is Canada? What's Canada's relation to the world? Why do we not really have a literature at this point? And what would that literature look like? Clarke was asking very different questions.
Right. That's a good point. I think, but it sounds like those who might have been thinking about or trying to figure out what Canadian literature is weren't really prepared to include someone like Mr. Clarke in his kind of writing. Maybe perhaps they had a bit more of a sort of sheltered perspective on what they thought Canadian literature might be.
Yeah, I think that's true. Canadian writers at the time were looking north and, in many respects, writing about wilderness, writing about sometimes their own traditions, sometimes traditions which weren't their own. So, appropriating Indigenous stories to make them fit into a kind of Canadian national narrative. Yeah. Writing about all the very kind of stereotypical things you think of as Canadian. This is not, this isn't always the case, but often it's the case.
Yeah.
And Clarke's depiction of urban Black life in Canada doesn't square with the Canadian critical thinking at the time in many ways, right? Blackness in Canada for many, many years is read as American, is read as belonging elsewhere, right? And particularly racism in Canada, which Clarke documents. But he doesn't just document, he excoriates and uses as kind of the fodder for his artistic expression.
Mm-hmm. I'd also like to talk a little bit about, to the extent that we can, what Austin Clarke was like as a person. Mainly because these details, like his work and its influence, are certainly all over the book, your book.
Yeah, Austin Clarke is a very interesting person. He doesn't fit any preconception of what you imagine he's going to be like.
Yeah.
He's too conservative for many of his radical or progressive readers, and he's too radical for his conservative friends. And that's part of, the joy of reading his work. You can revel in those contradictions. And these kind of performances come through both in his persona as a public figure and in his writing, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to think about this. In the 1960s, Clarke is taking on the persona, I think with a degree of irony, of the Black Power movement. So he's dressing in those styles, making pronouncements, and talking about the themes that animate the Black Power movement. And then in the 1970s, he runs for office for the Ontario Conservative Party, which is, how do you square these things? These are very different moves that one person would make, but he makes them. So he's a bit of a contradictory person. And I think part of that is Clarke came to Canada in many respects, expecting to be admitted to the highest kind of cultural echelons. He'd gone to an elite private school in Barbados. He was educated in a British system that, the class system is quite real there. And he believed that he'd received the formal training that would allow him to step into, a good position as a lawyer or working in economics or in government or something like that. And arriving in Canada, I would say Clarke discovers the fact of his Blackness, the way in which Blackness is going to become a barrier for Canadians to forever accepting him or allowing him to enter society. So he immediately becomes aware of these contradictions. And I think in a way he uses them to his advantage, right? He says, if you're going to read me one dimensionally, I'm going to operate multi-dimensionally. So you're always on unsure footing.
Yeah. So it's also kind of confrontational in some respects.
In many respects, he was a
Yeah.
confrontational person.
Hmm. So just kind of speaking about the book itself, I'd like to kind of ask you to talk a little bit about the deliberations, perhaps as they may have been related to you, that the contributors went through before they agreed to contribute to this volume.
Yeah, many of our contributors were extremely enthusiastic to write about Clarke,
Mm,
because he is a major figure for a generation of writers, more than one generation of writers in Canada. He opened a lot of doors and mentored a lot of writers,
right.
and so people that I had no sense they'd had a relationship to Austin Clarke approached me and said, Sonnet Labbe approached me and said, Austin Clarke actually really helped me with my writing, and not just with that, but with navigating the whiteness of the Canadian literary landscape. I have an essay for you, and it's a
Hmm.
personal essay, it's a reflection, but it's a great piece. So there was a lot of that. But there were also people who said, hey, I really like Austin Clarke and I really like his work, but he's an absolute pain in the ass to deal with a lot of the time. And I didn't always love him as a person. And I'm just not sure how I can square all these things together in a paper.
Yeah.
Um, and some people figured that out, and others just said, well, I'll politely not contribute because of that.
Yeah, I got that sense reading some of those contributions, that you can actually you see the sort of, I don't want to say struggle, but you see people wrestling with, um, the real desire to write about Austin Clarke and their relationship with him, but then also addressing at the same time how difficult that is for them to be doing. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, hey, some of that has to do with personal relationships. And,
Hmm.
you know, it's one thing to know somebody as an author, it's another thing to know them as the person that they are. And you've seen them in all their contradictions and weaknesses and so on. So there's that dimension of things.
Yeah.
But there's also, Clarke is a complex figure. And part of the difficulty that he presents to Canadian writing is a response to the racism that he experienced throughout his entire career, right? Of not
Hmm.
being read or not being reviewed or not being considered for awards. Um, and, I think it has to be contextualized in that respect.
Right. Exactly. Speaking of, Austin Clarke is sort of variously described as a man of style, which is, performative in one sense, but also he's making a statement. Can you talk about that sense of style, and how that related to his work? And then importantly, what Austin seemed to be projecting via that style about, broader Canadian culture and society.
Yeah. I mean, part of Austin's style has to do with a kind of self making,
Hmm.
a refusal to be read one dimensionally, a refusal
Yeah.
to say, um, okay, if you are going to try and come to know me just by virtue of the pigmentation of my skin, then I'm going to refuse that. I'm going to demonstrate all the flaws in your interpretation.
Yeah.
So, you know, style is a manner by which he's able to create perhaps a false intimacy with the people he's meeting, but also a way to perform various dimensions of himself and to refuse the one-dimensional reading. Um, CLR James has a line in, I think it's Beyond a Boundary, where he talks about his own upbringing in a very kind of British Caribbean household, where he says respectability was not an ideal, it was an armor. And what he means by that is the notion of respectability, of, I don't think mimicking is the right word, but practicing a kind of British genteelness or respectabilityness becomes an armor against the attacks of racism and so on. But if for James it was an armor, for Clarke it was a weapon, right? He was very happy to say, um, not only should you treat me equally, but you should probably treat me better than other people, because I've been to this school and I've gone to this college. He was very, he met the Queen at least twice, and he
Mm.
was totally at home having a conversation. In a way, you look at those photos and you think, this is a man who believes he belongs in Buckingham Palace. You know, this is a trajectory that he has had a lot of faith in, and finally it's come to be true that
Hmm.
he's arrived there.
Yeah.
I think also for style that connects back to his writing.
Yeah.
Um, Clarke's writing has so often been read as sociological, as a kind of report on Blackness in Canada in ways that we often don't read white writers, right? We don't say, this white writer is Don DeLillo is reporting on Italianness in New York City. It would be an absurd argument, right? We appreciate the writer for their style and their construction and so forth. And Clarke's writing demands that too. So style has to do with self-making, but also resisting a kind of one-dimensional reading of Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You just heard from Paul Barrett. He is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Paul's most recent book is called Remembering Austin Clarke. It's a volume of contributed essays about the Canadian writer, and the book, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, also features selected works by Clarke. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this series. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about how the book came together, the intense deliberations some of the potential contributors went through before agreeing to the project, and Paul's experience researching in the Austin Clarke archives.
Thought, okay, well, I'll go to McMaster and look at the Austin Clarke archives and see what they have. And he just published his final novel around this time, More. And I thought, okay, this could be an interesting publication history. So I went and looked through the material, and it turned out he'd been working on the book for 35 years. And this is where I started working on Clarke more seriously, as well as More. So he writes a letter to his friend and fellow writer, Sam Selvin, and he says, the line is, I'm dreaming of the millions this book is going to bring out, and I'm already tasting the Johnny Walker Double Black that I'm going to be drinking with that millions. This is in 1972. This novel was not coming out for a long time after.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.